What would you do if someone looked at you and saw nothing but your skin? No title, no dignity, no seat you paid for. Now imagine you're a black woman, quiet, powerful, carrying the weight of a company on your shoulders. You board a flight in first class, and within seconds, a flight attendant strikes you across the face. But here's the twist. She doesn't know who you are. She doesn't know you built the very airline she works for. She doesn't know the slap she just delivered is about to change everything. Not just for you, but for an entire industry. Who is this woman in seat 1A? Why doesn't she retaliate? And what happens when the quietest person on the plane turns out to be the one holding all the power? This is not just a story about injustice. It's about leadership, redemption, and what happens when silence is finally broken. If this story moves you, if you believe in dignity, in truth, and in the power of staying calm under fire, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Now, buckle up, because the flight is just about to take off. The gate area was loud with the familiar sounds of rolling suitcases, rushed footsteps, and half-hearted apologies. Flight 372 from JFK to Edinburgh was boarding on time, and most passengers barely looked up as they scanned their phones or dug through their bags. But one woman, walking with quiet grace, drew attention without trying. Dr. Nadine Holloway wore a navy pantsuit, simple, tailored, elegant. Her locks were pinned neatly behind her shoulders, her posture poised. She didn't walk with arrogance, but with clarity. Each step said, "I know exactly who I am." At 52, Nadine had just stepped into the most powerful role of her career, CEO of Jet Quasar Airlines. It was only her third week in the role, and no public announcement had been made yet. Her decision to fly on this commercial route, under her maiden name, was intentional. She wanted to understand the real passenger experience without fanfare. No one on board knew who she was, and she liked it that way. As she reached the jet bridge, a tall flight attendant with frosted blonde hair and a stiff smile gave her a once-over. The name on her badge read Marla. "Welcome aboard," Marla said, voice smooth and professional. Nadine nodded politely and stepped inside the cabin. Scanning for her seat 1A, first class, front left. The seat she'd chosen deliberately, not for comfort, but because she wanted to observe the boarding process clearly. First impressions told you a lot, but when Nadine reached her row, she paused. A young couple, early 30s maybe, sat side by side in seats 1A and 1B. They looked confused but content, laughing softly between themselves. Nadine blinked, double-checked her boarding pass, then gently cleared her throat. "Excuse me, I believe one of these seats is mine." 1A. The man looked up first, startled, and pulled out his boarding pass. "It says 1A here," he said. "Maybe a mix-up?" Nadine smiled faintly. "I'm sure we can sort it out." Marla appeared suddenly at Nadine's side. She had the kind of timing that suggested she had been watching, waiting for a moment like this. "Ma'am," she said, with a condescending tilt of her head, "are you sure you're in the right cabin? This is first class." Nadine's expression didn't change. "Yes, seat 1A." Marla extended her hand with a bright, forced smile. "May I see your boarding pass?" Nadine handed it over. Marla examined it for longer than necessary. Her lips pursed. "This says Holloway," Marla said, "but I don't see that name listed for 1A in the manifest. There must be some kind of error." Nadine kept her voice calm. "I booked under my maiden name. That's not uncommon." "Well, sometimes the system glitches," Marla replied, waving vaguely toward the front of the plane. "I'll ask you to take a seat in economy while we sort this out." We need to keep boarding moving. Nadine paused, not out of hesitation, but to choose her words carefully. I'd prefer we check the manifest and boarding records first. I'm not going anywhere until we confirm. A few heads in the nearby rows turned. The tension in the air thickened. I've been doing this job for over 30 years, Marla said, her voice tightening, and I know how to manage a boarding issue. Please step aside so I can help the other passengers. Nadine didn't budge. Her voice was still steady, but now had an edge. I'm not stepping aside. I paid for 1A. I'm asking you to verify it properly. The couple in 1A looked increasingly uncomfortable. The woman stood up. We don't mind switching seats, she said. It's our honeymoon. We just wanted to sit together. Marla's eyes narrowed. That won't be necessary. We'll get them new seats in economy. I'll see to it personally. Wait, the man said. We paid for first class. I mean, this wasn't cheap. We'll refund the difference, Marla snapped, her smile slipping. But we can't delay boarding for a misunderstanding. This isn't a misunderstanding, Nadine said. This is a simple check. Look up the reservation. Marla stared at her, and for the briefest second, something flared in her eyes. Not just annoyance, something deeper, something bitter. With her voice low and tight, she said, You people are always looking for special treatment. Time froze. It wasn't just the words. It was how she said them, like spitting out something foul. Nadine's chest went still. She'd heard that phrase before, too many times, but never like this. Not in the cabin of her own airline, not while doing nothing more than asking for her assigned seat. There was a silence, a heavy, deafening silence, and then, without warning, Marla's hand flew. A sharp, audible slap cracked through the air. Nadine's face jerked slightly to the side from the force. A collective gasp erupted in the cabin. The man in 1A stood up. The woman covered her mouth. A businessman 2 rows back dropped his phone. Even Marla seemed momentarily stunned by what she had done. Nadine brought her fingers slowly to her cheek. Her eyes met Marla's, calm, icy, controlled, no screaming, no dramatics, just quiet shock and something colder underneath. You've made a serious mistake, Nadine said, from the front of the plane. First Officer Sean Delgado emerged, confusion on his face. He had heard the slap, felt the drop in temperature inside the cabin. What's going on? He asked, stepping forward. Marla opened her mouth. She was refusing to comply, causing a disturbance. Nadine didn't look away. She looked directly at Sean. My name is Dr. Nadine Holloway, and I am the Chief Executive Officer of Jet Quasar Airlines. You may want to take your colleague to the galley. Now. Sean froze. Passengers stared, blinking in disbelief. Marla's face turned pale. Her mouth worked silently, but no sound came out. Nadine simply stepped aside and sat down in 1A her seat. She crossed her legs, pulled out her phone, and waited. Because this wasn't just about a slap, this was about everything. For a long, suspended second, the cabin existed in a strange kind of hush. People stared, no one moved, no one spoke. Time seemed to fold in on itself. Marla Riggs, still standing in the aisle with her arm half raised, blinked rapidly like she'd just woken up from a trance. Her hand slowly dropped to her side. Her face flushed, strained, stretched with something between regret and disbelief twitched in confusion. She had just slapped a passenger. That reality was still catching up to her. She hadn't known. She hadn't known who the woman was, and now she couldn't unknow it. Across from her, Dr. Nadine Holloway sat in 1A, back straight, hands calmly resting in her lap. Her cheeks still glowed with the aftermath of the impact, but there was no panic in her eyes, no tears, no raised voice that, somehow, made it worse. "I'll ask you again," Nadine said, her voice cutting through the stillness like silk across glass. "Please remove this flight attendant from the cabin. I'll speak with the crew lead and your corporate office upon arrival." Sean Delgado, the first officer, stood frozen for a breath. Then, without saying a word, he turned to Marla and gently placed a hand on her elbow. "Marla," he said quietly, "we need to step into the galley, now." Marla flinched at his touch, then nodded stiffly. Her gaze met Nadine's for a brief, trembling moment, and then she turned and disappeared toward the rear of the plane. As she passed through the curtain into the galley, several passengers began whispering. Nadine exhaled slowly. Her heart thudded in her ears, but her face remained composed. She knew people were watching her, judging her, guessing who she really was. She didn't care. The moment Marla disappeared from view, the young woman from the honeymoon couple stepped forward. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice shaking. "I didn't know what to do. That was unbelievable." Nadine looked at her gently. "It's not your fault." The man stepped forward too, still holding his boarding pass. "I don't want the seat anymore," he said awkwardly. "I didn't mean to cause a problem. There was no problem," Nadine replied, "until someone created one." They nodded and quietly stepped into the aisle. A crew member who had just emerged from the back gestured them toward a different row. Still stunned, they went without protest. Nadine sat back in her seat, adjusted the collar of her blouse, reached into her handbag and retrieved her tablet. She didn't cry, she did not shake, but inside, something old stirred. That word, "You people." She had heard it in elevators, in high-end department stores, behind veiled smiles at board meetings, but never like this. Never in such an intimate, intentional moment of cruelty. And the slap. It wasn't about pain. It was about erasure. The audacity to put hands on someone like her, someone who wasn't supposed to fight back, someone Marla had already decided was less. It wasn't just about Nadine. It was about every passenger who had ever sat down in a seat they had paid for, only to be made to feel like they didn't belong. Nadine looked down at her tablet. She stared at the Jet Quasar logo on the login screen. Her company, her responsibility now. And that meant this mess, this festering sore was hers to deal with. Sean Delgado returned 10 minutes later, looking paler than before. He stood beside her seat and bent slightly so no one else would hear. "Dr. Holloway," he began, his voice quiet, reverent. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. None of us did. You don't need to apologize for her," Nadine said calmly. "No, but I feel responsible," he said. "I should have stepped in sooner." "You did the right thing when it mattered," Nadine replied. "That's what counts now." He nodded, eyes scanning the cabin. "Captain Rawlings and I will file a full report. We're not taking this lightly." "You shouldn't," Nadine said, "and I'll need the names of every crew member on this flight, as well as the manifest incident logs and access to her employment file by the time we land. I'll take care of it personally," Sean promised. Nadine gave him a small, measured nod. "Thank you." He hesitated, then said, "Do you need medical attention?" "No," she said. "I need this flight to continue without further disturbance, and I need time to think." Sean left her alone. The remainder of the boarding process passed in awkward silence. The crew avoided eye contact with Nadine. The other passengers, particularly those in first class, sat upright in their seats, suddenly hyper-aware of their own presence. A few glanced over now and then, curiosity tugging at their expressions. Nadine felt the weight of it, but didn't react. She powered up her tablet, pulled up a blank document, and started typing. Not a report, not a complaint, something else. Notes, patterns, ideas, a future policy framework that was just starting to take shape in her mind. The airline had a problem, not just with one woman, with its culture, with the way problems like this could survive unnoticed or worse, protected behind seniority, tenure, and polite HR language. She thought about all the times in her career that she'd been told not to overreact, not to make it about race, not to be that kind of leader. And now she was the one with the power, and power meant she couldn't afford to let things slide. Not anymore. From the galley, she could hear muffled voices. Marla was probably being consoled. Maybe protesting, maybe crying, maybe saying she didn't mean it, that it was the stress, that she had a bad day, that she was being misunderstood. But Nadine wasn't interested in her excuses. She was interested in the system that allowed someone like Marla Riggs to remain in a position of authority for decades, to go unchecked, to act on her prejudice in a cabin full of people and still feel, somehow, justified. The seatbelt light dinged, the cabin doors closed, Flight 372 pushed back from the gate, beginning its journey across the Atlantic. As the engines roared to life and the plane angled toward the sky, Nadine leaned back, pressed her fingertips together, and stared out the window. Clouds rolled past. The city shrank below. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel vindicated. She felt a strange, aching sadness, because what had happened wasn't shocking. It was just familiar, and she knew now, more than ever, that the only way forward was through. She closed her eyes for a moment, just to rest, but her mind didn't slow, not even for a second. The sky above the Atlantic was calm, painted in soft gray streaks as Jet Quasar Flight 372 cruised at 38,000 feet. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was anything but. Nadine Holloway sat still in her seat, posture elegant, breathing steady. Outwardly, she looked composed, but inside, the storm was gathering. She had spent her life mastering that stillness. Decades in the corporate world had trained her well. When the boardroom boiled, she stayed ice cold. When condescension met her ideas, she sharpened them like blades. But this was different. This had been public, violent, personal, and it had come at 38,000 feet, in front of dozens of strangers, on a plane bearing her company's logo. She turned to look out the window again, watching clouds glide past like silent witnesses. From time to time, she could hear footsteps behind the curtain, the shuffle of trays, the whispered tension of flight attendants trying to carry on as if nothing had happened. But the air remained heavy. Even the other passengers in first class barely moved. They were waiting too, uncertain whether what they had witnessed would become a viral scandal or a story buried by the next news cycle. Nadine was thinking beyond both. She reached into the side compartment of her seat and pulled out her small leather notebook. The pages were filled with scribbled notes, ideas for restructuring the company's internal reporting systems, observations about crew behavior, and questions, lots of questions about how many Marla Riggs were working inside her airline, how many complaints had been filed, how many had been minimized, how many times had a customer been told they were just being sensitive and worse, how many never said anything at all. Her pen hovered above the page. She thought of her mother, a teacher who had once been slapped by a parent for failing their child. The school had defended the parent. Nadine had been only 9 when it happened, but the memory of her mother coming home, face bruised but voice calm, still lived in her chest. That quiet dignity, the kind that came from being a black woman in America, had become her compass. She had told herself she would build something different, and yet here she was, head of a multi-billion-dollar airline, assaulted in her own first-class cabin by one of her own employees, and all because Marla had looked at her and decided she didn't belong. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've reached cruising altitude. Meal service will begin shortly. Thank you for flying with Jet Quasar." Nadine almost laughed. The announcement sounded so normal, so detached from what had happened just moments ago. She put the notebook away. A younger flight attendant emerged from the galley, her face pale and her movements robotic. She carried a silver tray with a linen napkin and a glass of water. "Dr. Holloway," she said quietly, "may I get you anything I can bring your meal early, if you'd prefer?" "What's your name?" Nadine asked, her voice soft. The woman blinked. "Claire." "Thank you. Claire, water's fine for now." Claire placed the glass on Nadine's tray table, her hands trembling slightly. She hesitated before leaving. "I just want to say, I'm so sorry. That should never have happened." Nadine gave her a faint smile. "I appreciate you saying that." Claire looked down. "She trained me. Marla, I always thought she was just strict. Now I don't know what to think." "You trust your instincts," Nadine said. "They're usually telling the truth." Claire nodded, then slipped away. Nadine sipped her water. The glass trembled slightly in her fingers, not from fear, but from restraint. Every part of her wanted to act, call the legal department, release a statement, fire half the management team, but this had to be surgical, not loud, effective. She pulled out her phone and sent a secure message to her assistant back in New York. "Prepare emergency session with full board tomorrow. Priority access to HR files. Past 5 years. Flag complaints marked unresolved. Do not brief anyone yet. I want the raw data." The reply came within seconds. "Understood. Will compile overnight. Meeting blocked for 9 a.m. Est." Nadine locked her phone and leaned back again. She thought of Malcolm, her husband, probably finishing his set at the Jazz Lounge in Manhattan by now. He always texted after the last song. She wondered what she would say when he asked how the flight went. A bit of turbulence, love, but nothing I couldn't handle. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to rest, but her mind kept spiraling. Would this leak to the press? Should it? She could already see the headlines. Black CEO assaulted by airline's own staff. Or worse, passenger slapped in first class. No mention of who she was, no context, just scandal bait, and then the backlash, the comments, the "what did she do to deserve it" crowd. She had seen it all before, but this time she had the power to do more than just weather it. From the galley, voices rose. "You don't understand," Marla hissed, her voice carrying through the cabin curtain. "I understand plenty," Sean responded. "You struck a passenger. You humiliated someone in front of everyone on board. She disrespected me. She asked for her seat. She had an attitude. She had a boarding pass." Silence followed. Then Marla said, quieter, "I've given 30 years to this airline, and you might have just thrown it all away in 30 seconds. Nadine didn't move. She just sat still, letting their words wash over her. It was always the same story. A long career, a good record, a few angry moments excused as stress or misunderstanding. But the truth was always hiding in the cracks. How people like Marla spoke to some passengers versus others. The tone, the patience, the assumptions. It wasn't just bigotry and shouts. It was in sighs, in eye rolls, in who got offered help and who got scrutinized for needing it. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was from Malcolm. Land safe, she stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the screen. Still in the air, but I'm fine. She hit send, then turned the screen face down. The lights in the cabin dimmed for the overnight portion of the flight. Nadine closed her eyes and let the dark fill her vision. Sleep did not come, but something else did. Resolve. The wheels touched down on the damp Edinburgh tarmac with a muted screech, followed by the familiar jolt of inertia as the plane decelerated. The cabin, still cloaked in a strained hush, stirred slightly at the signal to prepare for arrival. Dr. Nadine Holloway kept her seat upright and her hands folded in her lap. She didn't reach for her bag. She didn't glance at the window. Her gaze was forward, locked somewhere just past the curtain that separated her from the rest of the aircraft. She was tired, yes, but it wasn't physical exhaustion. It was the kind that settled into your bones when disappointment became too familiar. Marla had not reappeared. Claire, the young attendant, had continued her quiet, nervous service throughout the flight. She had refilled Nadine's water without asking, brought a warm blanket after the lights dimmed, and offered her a breakfast tray Nadine politely declined. No words were exchanged beyond necessity, just eyes, and Claire's had said everything. A sharp ding signaled the end of the flight. Seatbelt signs blinked off. Passengers unbuckled and began their ritual reaching for overhead bins, stretching limbs, murmuring half-hearted goodbyes. But no one looked at Nadine. She stayed seated while the rest of first class stood around her. The couple from earlier avoided her eyes, too, though the woman glanced back once with a flicker of shame. The co-pilot, Sean Delgado, appeared at the front of the cabin. His expression was grim, but composed. He approached quietly, pausing beside Nadine's seat. "Dr. Holloway," he said, "we've alerted ground control. Security and airline operations are waiting at the gate. If it's all right with you, they'd like to speak to you immediately." Nadine nodded once. "That's fine. I've filed a preliminary report, and I've made sure the captain has co-signed it." "Good," she said. "I'll need copies of both." "Absolutely. And, just so you know, she's still on board, in the back galley, under escort." Nadine didn't ask for her name. She didn't need to. Marla Riggs was etched into her memory now. Not as a villain, but as a mirror. One that reflected a deeper rot than a single slap could reveal. Passengers filed off. Some gave her wide berth, others cast furtive, confused glances, sensing something had happened, but unsure of its shape. When the cabin was nearly empty, Nadine stood, she smoothed the front of her blazer, rolled her shoulders once, and stepped forward. Sean walked beside her down the jet bridge, silent but steady. At the end stood three people, 2 uniformed officers and a fourth man in a tailored suit who held a tablet nervously against his chest. The man stepped forward first, extending his hand. "Dr. Holloway, I'm Darren Young. I oversee Jet Quasar ground operations here in Edinburgh. I can't tell you how sorry I am for what's happened." Nadine shook his hand briefly. "We'll have time for apologies later. Right now, I'd like to give my statement." "Of course," Darren said quickly. "We've arranged a private lounge just down the corridor." She followed them in silence, her heels tapping softly against the industrial carpet. No one spoke. Even the officers moved with a sense of hush, as if they, too, were absorbing the gravity of what they had been told. The lounge was cool and quiet, furnished with modern leather chairs and tall windows that overlooked the runway. A kettle steamed faintly in the corner. A young woman had left 2 cups of tea already prepared on the low table. Nadine ignored them. One officer, a tall woman with dark braids and a calm presence, sat opposite her and opened a notepad. "I'm Officer Patrice Evans," she said. "We've reviewed the initial report filed by the flight crew. I'd like to walk through your account, if you're ready." "I'm ready," Nadine said. Her voice was even, her words precise. She recounted the incident from the moment she approached her assigned seat to the moment Marla's hand struck her face. She did not embellish. She did not dramatize. She simply told the truth. Officer Evans listened without interruption, her pen scratching across the page. When Nadine finished, there was a beat of silence. "Do you intend to press charges?" she asked. "Yes," Nadine said. The second officer, who had been largely quiet, looked up. "You're certain I am? She assaulted me, not in private, but in front of witnesses, and while acting in a professional capacity as a representative of my company, there will be criminal and civil consequences." Evans nodded. "We'll take her statement as well. She's currently being held in a secure interview room. Make sure she's given the opportunity to contact a lawyer," Nadine added. "I want this handled properly." The officers exchanged a look, respect, surprise, perhaps, at her clarity and restraint. When they left the room to proceed with their part of the investigation, Darren Young remained. He looked pale, like he hadn't slept in days. "Dr. Holloway," he said, clearing his throat. "I've just gotten off the phone with HQ in New York. They confirmed everything. Who you are, your position. I assumed they would." "I had no idea," he said softly. I treated you as I would any passenger." But she raised a hand gently, stopping him. "It's not about who I am," she said. "It's about what she felt entitled to do, and how many people let her get that way." Darren looked down. "Her file has already been flagged. HR is pulling every complaint we've ever received with her name on it. I've been told to forward the full file to you immediately. Unredacted," Nadine said. "Of course. I want to see every passenger complaint, every manager's note, every time she was spoken to without consequence. You'll have it within the hour." She looked at him, her eyes softening just slightly, and Darren schedule a video conference with the executive board. 9 a.m. New York time tomorrow. I'll be joining from here. The agenda is corporate culture. And this will not be a discussion. It will be a directive. He nodded rapidly, tapping the note into his tablet. Understood. Crystal clear. Nadine stood. She felt the ache in her shoulders now, in her legs, in the corner of her temple where tension had bloomed hours ago. But there was no weakness in her spine, only momentum. She exited the lounge with her carry-on, declining the offer for an escort. She didn't need one. What she needed was time. Time to read, time to plan, time to shake the very foundation of the company she now owned. The hive had been struck. Now it was time to see which parts of it would survive. The hotel suite in Edinburgh was quiet, dimly lit, and smelled faintly of fresh linen and citrus-scented wood polish. The kind of neutral space designed to comfort any traveler, anywhere. But Nadine Holloway didn't feel comforted. She felt alert, focused, coldly awake. She sat at the long desk beneath the window. Laptop open, files open, tea untouched. Outside, the sun was beginning to rise over the Scottish hills. The light stretched across the skyline like a reluctant apology. Another day, another fight. Nadine had spent the last 5 hours combing through every document Darren Young had sent. True to his word, the files had arrived within the hour. A secure folder, password protected, sent directly from the Home Office servers. The file was labeled Marla Riggs' Full History. It was over 200 pages long, performance reviews, passenger comment logs, email chains, disciplinary records, training certifications, internal memos, and tucked between the praises and airline lingo were the real stories. Nadine highlighted and color-coded as she read. She made notes. She muttered to herself. Passenger A. The flight attendant in 4C was dismissive when I asked for water. She rolled her eyes and said, "You people always need something." I was shocked. Passenger B is a disabled traveler. I expected basic assistance. Instead, I was made to feel like a burden. Passenger C. I watched her snap at a black couple traveling with a toddler. She scolded them for walking the aisle too much. Later, she joked to another passenger that some folks don't know how to raise children. And on it went. Nadine counted 37 complaints over a period of 9 years. 37. Most of them were followed by this identical phrase in her record, addressed informally with employee. No formal action required. One note even praised Marla for her consistency and firmness in passenger interactions. Firmness, Nadine repeated under her breath. Another file caught her attention. It was an old one, a handwritten note from a junior flight attendant, dated 6 years ago. The young woman had submitted an anonymous concern about hostile and racially insensitive remarks made during layovers. She never signed her name. No follow-up was documented. Nadine closed her eyes for a moment. Her jaw tightened. It was all there, hiding in plain sight. The culture had not just ignored it, it had normalized it. At 6:30 a.m., her phone buzzed, a message from Malcolm. "Are you up?" She stared at the screen for a second before typing. Barely, reading personnel files, his response came back instantly. "Should I fly out? No. I need you rested. Keep playing. I'll be okay." He sent back a heart emoji, followed by, "You're not just okay. You're fire." Nadine allowed herself a soft smile for just a second. Then she exhaled and got back to work. At 7:15 a.m., her assistant in New York sent the confirmed board roster. All executive members were set to join the video call. No one had declined, they knew. By 8:00 a.m. local time, she had showered, dressed, and set up her camera in the hotel's small conference suite. The room was plain, its walls a dull beige, but Nadine made it look like a war room. She wore a charcoal blazer and no jewelry, save for the slim silver wedding band on her left hand. The call went live at 9:00 a.m. Eastern. 12 boxes filled the screen. 12 faces, all of them familiar, heads of finance, legal, operations, in-flight services, HR, public affairs. Most were men. Most had been with Jet Quasar for decades. Some smiled cautiously. Others looked tense. Nadine didn't bother with greetings. She began with one sentence. "Yesterday, I was slapped by a Jet Quasar flight attendant." There was silence. Total, jaw-dropped silence. She waited a full 5 seconds, letting it hang. Then she continued, her voice low but unwavering. "She looked at me. She decided I didn't belong, and when I calmly asked for the seat I had paid for, she denied me, mocked me, and finally assaulted me. No one interrupted." Nadine tapped the screen, pulling up the shared document. "Her name is Marla Riggs. You all know her. She's been with us for over 30 years. She's trained half our cabin crew. She's been praised for her efficiency, her consistency, her firmness." She paused. "I've reviewed her entire employment file. From the first interview to the last performance bonus, the document flashed. Complaint after complaint appeared." Nadine scrolled slowly. "This is who we've trusted with our customers." Gregory, the head of in-flight services, cleared his throat. "Nadine, if I may, This is obviously very serious, but I don't think she cut him off with a glance. This is not a discussion. Gregory, this is a reckoning. He sank back in his chair. She turned to Elijah Granger, the HR director. He looked pale and sweaty. Elijah, she said, I want to ask you one question. He nodded stiffly. How does someone collect 37 complaints about racially biased behavior over 9 years and never face a formal review? He started to speak. Stopped. Started again. I followed protocol. We never had proof. It was her word against theirs. She had seniority. You followed silence, Nadine said. You followed comfort. You followed the path of least resistance. She leaned forward. But from this point forward, our path is different, effective immediately. Marla Riggs is terminated, not quietly, not privately. Her dismissal will be documented and explained. Elijah swallowed, effective immediately. She repeated, You are also stepping down. The camera blinked. Elijah opened his mouth, stunned. This company needs a head of people and culture who actually understands both. She tapped the table once. I want a new candidate list by the end of the week. Candidates with a proven record of equity, reform, and accountability. She paused again. The room was silent. Some faces looked stunned, others ashamed. Nadine let her eyes meet each square on the screen. Jet Quasar is not going to bury this. We're going to learn from it, we're going to confront it, and we're going to rebuild. She tapped the screen again. A new document opened. A plan. Starting this quarter, we're launching a full audit of all passenger complaints over the past 5 years. Every ignored case, every muted voice. We're hiring an independent equity firm to lead the investigation. She leaned back in her chair. This airline will either lead with integrity or it will collapse from rot. I will not carry a company that pretends to be modern while upholding traditions of exclusion. She let the final sentence land with weight. Then she ended the call. No goodbyes, no thank yous, just action. The quiet kind that moves mountains. By mid-morning, the first headlines had begun to ripple across the internet. A leaked report from a ground employee at Edinburgh International Airport made its way to a freelance aviation blogger. From there, it took less than an hour for the story to ignite. CEO of Jet Quasar slapped by flight attendant in first class. Nadine Holloway assaulted mid-flight by own crew member 30 years of service. Ends in one blow. The media frenzy didn't come from a press release. It came from whispers, screenshots, airport employees texting relatives, passengers filming post-flight security presence on their phones. Someone caught Nadine walking through the terminal with a straight back and unreadable eyes. The photo, grainy and poorly framed, was enough. It confirmed the rumor. She hadn't spoken to press. Not yet. She had more important things to do. In her Edinburgh hotel suite, Nadine stood in front of the window again, watching the city move slowly below. Her phone buzzed incessantly, but she ignored most of it. She had asked her assistant to filter her calls and emails. Only direct texts from Malcolm or the executive compliance team would get through. Jet Quasar's internal system was groaning under the pressure. By noon, the customer service inbox had been flooded with thousands of emails, some offering support, some demanding answers, some angry that the story was being suppressed. It wasn't. It was being processed. Nadine wasn't interested in controlling the narrative. She was interested in fixing the truth. A knock came at the door. She opened it to find Darren Young holding a tablet and looking like he hadn't slept. "Morning, Dr. Holloway," he said, voice hesitant. "Come in." He stepped inside, set the tablet down on the desk. We've completed a sweep of the passenger logs from the last 5 years, just like you asked. I've had a team cross-reference all the complaints by employee name." Nadine sat down and opened the file. "I had them color-code entries," Darren said. "Red for complaints involving bias or discrimination. Yellow for misconduct, green for positive reviews." The spreadsheet bloomed across the screen like a brutal patchwork. Red was everywhere. Nadine scrolled slowly. It wasn't just Marla. There were others, names that appeared again and again, attached to incidents that looked eerily similar. Wrong tone, dismissive language, blatant gatekeeping, passengers relocated without explanation, staff refusing to offer assistance to elderly, disabled, or non-English-speaking customers. The pattern was undeniable. "How many employees are we talking about?" Nadine asked. 37 with red flags, 17 of them with more than 5 complaints each. 11 are still active crew. She nodded. "And what's our standard response time to customer complaints?" "Officially, 48 hours. Unofficially," Darren grimaced, "a week, sometimes more." Nadine let out a slow breath. "Do you know what I see when I look at this?" He shook his head. "I see neglect." She said, "I see indifference masquerading as policy. I see a company that let its frontline people treat customers like inconveniences." Darren was quiet. "File this entire report with our compliance office," Nadine said. "And copy me." "Yes, ma'am." "And Darren." "Yes." "None of this is confidential anymore." His eyes widened. "You're releasing it?" "Not everything, but the audit, yes. In summary form, we need to show people that we're not hiding, that we're holding ourselves accountable. I'll notify our legal team." "You do that." After he left, Nadine sat back in the chair and closed her eyes for a moment. Her mind kept drifting back to the slap, not the sting of it, which had faded, but the force behind it, the certainty. Marla had been so sure she was right, so sure she was entitled to say and do what she did without consequence. That certainty didn't come from nowhere. It came from decades of never being told no. A vibration from her phone broke the silence. It was Malcolm. The screen lit up with a video call request. She accepted. His face appeared, framed by the warmth of their Brooklyn apartment. He looked tired too, but calm. "You okay?" he asked softly. Nadine nodded. "As okay as I can be. I saw the news. It's everywhere. I know. How are you holding up, really?" She hesitated. "I'm furious, but not at her. Not just her." He waited. "I'm angry at the silence," she said. "At the structure. At how we reward people for being efficient, but never question how they treat others. At how long it takes for one person's pain to matter." Malcolm nodded slowly. "I've watched you lead in rooms full of men who underestimated you. But this is different. I'm not just leading a company now," she said. "I'm rebuilding it, from the inside." He smiled gently, then burn the blueprint and draw a better one. She smiled back, the corner of her mouth softening. "That's the plan." After they hung up, she pulled out a notepad and began outlining the framework for a new initiative. Not just diversity training. That was too easy, too performative. She wrote the words slowly at the top of the page. Passenger Dignity Program. A commitment to unbiased service, transparent complaint handling, and direct oversight from the executive level. A system where no complaint could be buried, where every voice had weight. She flipped to the next page and began drafting the core message for the internal release. "We do not fly above accountability." By late afternoon, her assistant sent confirmation that the internal memo was ready to go company-wide. The audit summary would be included. So would Nadine's personal statement. So would the new steps moving forward. The pushback started within an hour. Emails from department heads, concerns from legal, messages warning her to proceed more cautiously. Nadine read each one, then deleted them. She knew what cautious leadership looked like. It looked like silence. That evening, Nadine received a message she didn't expect. It came from Sean Delgado, the first officer from Flight 372. Subject line: I've been thinking about what I saw. His message was short: Dr. Holloway. I've spent all day trying to figure out what I should have done differently on that flight. I saw something wrong and I froze. You didn't. You stood your ground with grace. I want you to know I'm learning from that. I won't freeze again. She stared at the screen for a moment, then hit reply. Sean, you did step in, and now you've stepped forward. That's more than most. Keep going. She sent it, then closed the laptop. That night, she slept deeply for the first time in 3 days. Not because the fight was over, but because it had finally, truly begun. 3 days had passed since the incident. For some, it felt like an eternity. For others, like a match still burning in the dark. In a small house tucked into a quiet suburb of Queens, Marla Riggs sat at her kitchen table, unmoving. The morning light filtered through the blinds in weak, reluctant slants. Her coffee had gone cold. She hadn't touched it. The silence in the room was absolute, except for the occasional creak of the refrigerator and the ticking of the wall clock. Her phone sat face down on the table. She hadn't turned it on since yesterday. Not since she saw her name splashed across a dozen news websites, attached to headlines that made her stomach churn. Former flight attendant assaults CEO mid-flight, jet quasar under fire for ignoring years of misconduct, 30 years in the sky, grounded by one decision. She stared at nothing. Her thoughts looped in circles. She had known it was wrong. Even as her hand moved, she had felt the line being crossed. But by then, the weight of years of bitterness had propelled her. And afterward, when Nadine Holloway revealed who she was, the floor beneath her had collapsed. Now, no one was returning her calls. The union rep hadn't picked up. Her supervisor sent a single text that read, "This is being handled at the corporate level." And her sister, her own sister, had left a voicemail that said, "Marla, I don't know what you were thinking." She hadn't been thinking. That was the truth. She had just seen another woman standing in a space she thought belonged to someone else, and she had reacted. That was the part that shamed her most. How fast it had come. How easy. There was a knock at the door. She flinched, then rose slowly to answer it. A courier stood outside, holding a thick envelope. "Marla Riggs," he asked. She nodded. "Sign here. Please." She scribbled her name with a hand that trembled, then took the envelope. It was from a law firm in Manhattan. The return address made her chest tighten. Back at the table, she opened it carefully. Inside was a formal letter. A civil lawsuit had been filed. Personal, not through the airline. It was from Dr. Nadine Holloway herself. Marla didn't cry. Not yet. She read every word. The language was sharp, clean, legal, damages, emotional distress, assault. Attached was a list of every documented passenger complaint ever filed against her. Dozens. She had never seen them all lined up like that. Then she found it. A small, handwritten note on thick stationery. Simple. 4 words. "I hope you learn." She stared at that note for what felt like hours. Not, "I hope you suffer." Not, "I hope you lose." "I hope you learn." That was worse, somehow. It wasn't anger, it was expectation, and it broke something inside her. She sat back down. finally picked up the coffee and drank it cold. In Edinburgh, Nadine Holloway stood inside the Jet Quasar satellite office. The walls were covered in whiteboards now, handwritten goals and bullet points scrawled in blue marker. Audits, reviews, reforms. Beside her, Darren Young was going over final logistics for the Passenger Dignity program. He had remained grounded, consistent, quietly efficient. Nadine was beginning to trust him. Across the table sat two new hires, not consultants, not PR specialists, people, real people. One was a woman in her 60s, a retired school administrator who had filed a discrimination complaint against Jet Quasar 3 years ago and never received a response. The other was a young man in his 20s, deaf, who had been denied boarding assistance and left waiting on the tarmac for nearly an hour. They were part of Nadine's new passenger advisory panel, a board that would meet quarterly, submit recommendations directly to her office, and be involved in rewriting the company's service protocols. This isn't a formality, Nadine told them. This isn't branding, this is foundation. The older woman, named Ruth, had smiled. You're the first executive I've ever met who wanted to hear what it's actually like back in row 29. Nadine smiled back. I started in row 29. I don't forget. The headlines were beginning to shift. CEO leads sweeping reform. Jet Quasar sets new industry standard for accountability. Passenger voices finally land in the boardroom, but Nadine didn't celebrate. Not yet. Later that evening, her assistant handed her another envelope. This one came in the mail, handwritten, no return address. Inside was a letter. The handwriting was shaky, slanted, older-style cursive. Dear Dr. Holloway, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect sympathy. I just want you to know that I understand now, not just what I did, but what it meant. Every small moment, every ignored voice, every time I chose silence over kindness, I see it now. All of it. There's no excuse. I am sorry. Marla Riggs. Nadine read it once, then again. She didn't feel satisfied. She didn't feel vengeance. She felt the weight of the thing they had both carried Marla for too long, and Nadine because she had no choice. That night, Nadine sat alone in her suite. She opened a drawer, pulled out her own personal stationery, and wrote a short note. She folded it carefully, attached it to a check, modest but meaningful, not compensation, not charity, an investment. The note read, use this to build something better. Everyone has the capacity to change. N. Holloway. The envelope was sent the next morning. No press release, no camera crew, no applause, just one human reaching out to another, across a divide that had been crossed not by power, but by truth. The aviation industry had seen scandals before, cancellations, technical malfunctions, viral meltdowns recorded by passengers and uploaded before planes even landed. But this was different. This was not a headline born from chaos. It was born from silence, the kind that settles over decades, the kind that hardens, and now that silence was being broken. By the 8th day, Jet Quasar's Passenger Dignity program was trending across every major platform, not because it was flashy, but because it was personal. Real people were being hired to guide policy. Frontline crew were sharing their experiences anonymously on forums. Former passengers were reposting their own stories, tagging the airline and using a new hashtag that had quietly gone viral. Heard at last. Under that tag lived a growing archive of voices. A woman who had been scolded for speaking Spanish to her elderly mother during boarding. A trans man who had been misgendered repeatedly by cabin crew. A family whose autistic child had been accused of being disruptive, only to be forced to switch seats. They weren't all Jet Quasar customers, but it didn't matter. Nadine's decision had ignited a national conversation about service, dignity, and unconscious bias above the clouds. CNN requested an exclusive interview, so did the New York Times. Nadine declined both. Instead, she sat down with a local podcast out of Baltimore, hosted by a black journalist who had once been denied a business class upgrade despite holding elite status. The interview lasted 45 minutes. It was raw, thoughtful, full of quiet revelations, and when the episode dropped, it soared to the top of every major chart. In the interview, Nadine said one thing that stuck. You don't need to be loud to make change. You just have to be willing to stay in the room when it gets uncomfortable. By the end of the week, 2 other major airlines had announced internal culture reviews. A third launched a survey asking customers to rate their experience with staff respect. Nadine wasn't watching them. She was too busy working. She had moved to Jet Quasar's New York headquarters temporarily. Her corner office on the 41st floor now looked more like a situation room. She'd ordered all awards and framed accolades removed. In their place were timelines, audit graphs, passenger feedback loops, and photos of real customers who had experienced discrimination. One afternoon, she stood in front of her new executive leadership team, a younger, more diverse group of professionals, many of them promoted internally after the first wave of restructuring. She clicked to the next slide in her presentation, a photo of a little boy holding his mother's hand as they waited in an airport line. The boy's face was tired, the mother's exhausted. "This is who we fly for," Nadine said. "Not shareholders, not PR, them." Heads nodded, pens moved, later. As the meeting ended, a junior analyst named Alicia approached her in the hallway. "Dr. Holloway," she said, breathless. "I just wanted to say, when I joined this company 2 years ago, I didn't think anyone like me could ever sit in a room like that. But today, I did." Nadine placed a hand gently on Alicia's shoulder. Rooms don't belong to anyone until someone claims them. That evening, as she walked out of the building and into the crisp Manhattan night, Malcolm was waiting on the sidewalk. His saxophone case hung over one shoulder. "You said 6 sharp?" he teased. She leaned into his hug, tension melting from her shoulders. "You still playing at the Blue Note every Wednesday?" He smiled. "Want to come hear me miss a few notes? I could use a little jazz." They took the subway together, Nadine quiet as the train rumbled underneath the city. She watched people come and go, office workers, students, a woman asleep with her suitcase balanced on her lap. The city moved on, as it always did, but something inside Nadine was shifting. At the Blue Note, Malcolm played a set that rose and fell like breathing. Nadine sat near the back, nursing a cup of tea, letting the music untangle her thoughts. She wasn't rebuilding just for passengers. She was rebuilding for the people who worked here, for the crew members who had been taught to follow, not question, for the managers who had been trained to look the other way, for the dreamers who joined the industry hoping to fly, only to be grounded by systems too rigid to change. Back in Queens, Marla Riggs sat at her dining table again. This time, there was no coffee, just a notebook. On the first page, she had written 2 words, "Start again." It hadn't been easy. The news cycle had named her, dragged her, dissected her. She had received hate mail. She had also received something else, a letter and a check. She hadn't cashed it. Not yet. She read Nadine's note again every morning. "Use this to build something better. Everyone has the capacity to change." Marla had begun volunteering at a community center in her neighborhood. At first, she just handed out pamphlets. But last week, She led her first workshop on unconscious bias. It was awkward. She stumbled, but she told the truth. When someone asked, "Why should we listen to you?" she answered without flinching, "Because I failed, and I want to understand why." The room had gone quiet. Then someone clapped. Just one person. But it was enough. She no longer expected forgiveness, but she was working toward redemption. At Jet Quasar's training facility in Dallas, a new flight attendant cohort was preparing for final certification. Their final exam now included a simulation called Scenario 1A. In it, a senior black woman quietly boards a first-class seat. The attending crew member must engage with her, review her boarding pass, and resolve any ambiguity professionally and without assumption. The scenario was real, based on Nadine's own experience, and it ended with a single sentence projected on the screen after the session. "How you treat someone in Seat 1A says everything about your airline." The trainees left the room changed. Back in New York, Nadine walked into her apartment past midnight. She kicked off her shoes, hung up her blazer, and found Malcolm asleep on the couch, book still open on his chest. She smiled. As she poured herself a glass of water, her phone buzzed once. A message from the Secretary of Transportation. "We'd like to discuss your leadership on recent reforms. You're setting a precedent." Nadine set the phone down. She didn't need recognition, but she knew this was only the beginning. The sky was changing, and this time, everyone would fly with dignity. The halls of the Dirksen Senate Office building were polished and reverent, designed to hold power and history in the same breath. The ceilings were high. The air carried a hush, like a cathedral that swapped prayer for policy. Nadine Holloway walked those halls with the same calm composure she had always worn. No security entourage, no PR handler trailing behind. Just her assistant, Maya, walking 2 steps behind with a leather folder tucked close to her chest. It had been 19 days since the flight. 19 days since a hand had struck her face and opened a national conversation. Today, she would testify before the Senate Subcommittee on Transportation and Aviation Safety. The hearing was titled Accountability at Altitude Addressing Passenger Rights and Corporate Responsibility. The room was already full when Nadine arrived. Journalists lined the rear benches. Airline executives from across the industry sat stiffly in the gallery. A few staffers whispered into earpieces while checking their watches, but all eyes shifted when Nadine entered. Senator Lenora King of Illinois, who chaired the committee, stood to greet her. A tall black woman in her early 60s. Senator King had made history when she won her seat and kept it by speaking plainly and acting quickly. "Dr. Holloway," she said warmly. "Welcome." Nadine extended her hand. "Thank you, Senator. You ready? I'm steady." King smiled. "That's what I like to hear." Nadine took her seat at the long witness table. A glass of water sat untouched beside the microphone. The nameplate in front of her read Dr. Nadine Holloway, CEO, Jet Quasar Airlines. To her left was the CEO of another major airline, and to her right, a legal representative from the National Flight Crew Association. Neither made eye contact. The hearing began with opening statements. Senator King spoke first. "We're here because something happened in our skies that was caught not on camera, but in conscience." One woman spoke up, and in doing so, revealed a silence many of us have carried for too long. "Dr. Holloway, the floor is yours." Nadine turned on the microphone. Her voice was calm and even, her words paced with care. 3 weeks ago, I boarded a flight from New York to Edinburgh. I was assigned a first-class seat. When I tried to sit down, I was questioned, doubted, and ultimately assaulted by a crew member. I'm not here today because of the assault. I am here because of what led to it, and what allowed it to go unchallenged for so long." She paused. "I am a black woman. I am a CEO. But on that flight, I was seen as neither. I was seen as someone who didn't belong. That perception did not begin with that one flight attendant. It began with a system that tolerates assumptions, excuses aggression, and fears accountability." Her words landed like slow thunder. The room didn't shift. It absorbed. "I've spent the last few weeks auditing my own company. I found over a decade of complaints ignored, downplayed, forgotten. I terminated careers. I issued public apologies. But I also created a program to rebuild from the ground up, not just to check boxes, to change behavior." Senator King leaned forward slightly. "What's been the hardest part of that process?" "Doctor." Holloway Nadine looked at her with soft, tired eyes. "Deciding who gets a second chance," she said. A murmur passed through the chamber. "Some people make mistakes. Others make patterns. Knowing the difference is hard, and the stakes are high." King nodded slowly. "Do you believe this is a company issue or an industry issue?" "It's a societal issue," Nadine answered. "But airlines amplify it. At 30,000 feet, a gatekeeper becomes a gate. And when a passenger is mistreated mid-flight, they can't just walk away. We are custodians of not just safety, but dignity." Senator Raphael Marks, a skeptic from Arizona, shifted in his chair. "With all due respect, Dr. Holloway, aren't we overcorrecting? We're talking about a single incident here." Nadine looked at him. "It wasn't a single incident. It was the first one that mattered enough to reach you." There was silence. Even the stenographer paused for a beat. Nadine turned to the other executives at the table. "I'm not here to shame anyone. I know what it takes to run an airline, but I also know what it costs to ignore people. That cost is no longer acceptable." After the questions concluded, Nadine stepped out of the room, her posture still tall. Reporters called her name. Flashes went off, but she kept walking. Outside, under the soft spring sunlight of Washington, D.C., she stood alone for a moment on the marble steps. Maya caught up with her, breathing slightly harder. "You handled that like a conductor," Maya said, every word in tempo. Nadine gave a small smile. "It's easier to speak when you're not protecting yourself anymore." They began the walk to the car. "Senator King wants to meet privately," Maya said. "Wants to discuss forming a civilian airline oversight board. She wants your input." "Tell her I'm in," Nadine replied without hesitation. Back in New York, Malcolm had been watching the hearing from their living room. A few musician friends sat with him, stunned into silence. When it ended, one of them, a pianist, muttered, "Damn, that wasn't a CEO, that was a movement." Malcolm just smiled. "Told y'all." That night, Nadine returned home past midnight. She didn't collapse into bed. She went to the window, looking out over Brooklyn. The city breathed around her, distant and alive. She thought of all the passengers still boarding planes tonight, people heading to funerals, to weddings, to job interviews and new lives, people with grief in their suitcases and hope in their chest pockets. She thought of the ones who had once been ignored, and the ones who would never be again. Then she sat down at her desk and opened her notebook. On a fresh page, she wrote the title, Flight 372, The Slap That Opened the Sky. She wasn't writing it for the public. She was writing it for herself, to remember, to make sense, to ensure that the story never belonged to silence again. It was a quiet Thursday morning when Nadine received the letter. Her assistant, Maya, had just dropped off the day's folder of updates, performance metrics from the Passenger Dignity Program, survey responses, meeting prep for a conference next week. But there was something else. A plain, white envelope, handwritten in soft, curving script. Nadine raised an eyebrow. No sender. She opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small photograph. She read the letter once, then again, slower this time. Dear Dr. Holloway, you don't know me, but I know you. Not in the way a person knows a celebrity. Not from articles or podcasts or the hearing on C-SPAN. I know you because I was on Flight 372. I was in the back, row 33, seat C, economy middle. I saw what happened. I saw the moment she slapped you. I saw the way your face changed but didn't flinch. I was too far away to intervene. Too afraid, if I'm honest. But what I saw changed me. I'm a trainee, or I was. Today I graduate. Jet Quasar accepted me into the latest cohort of cabin crew, and I'm writing this from my hotel the night before my final evaluation. When they taught us Scenario 1A, they told us it was based on real events. They never said who, but I knew. I recognized your face, your silence, your strength. I want to thank you. Because of you, I will never assume anything about the person in front of me. Because of you, I will carry every passenger like they matter. Because of you, I found courage I didn't know I had. You turned a moment of pain into a legacy of change. Enclosed is a photo of my badge. Tomorrow, I'll pin it to my uniform for the first time, and I'll remember who you are with deepest respect. Kelsey Monroe. The photograph was small and slightly smudged. A young black woman in uniform stood in front of a Jet Quasar training facility, her smile bright but shy. The light caught the edge of her name tag, Monroe. Nadine sat back slowly in her chair. Her fingers brushed the paper, and she let herself be still. Outside her office, the city moved forward. Inside her heart, something softened. Later that day, she walked through the training floor at Jet Quasar's headquarters. Recruits were practicing de-escalation scenarios, emergency protocols, meal service timing. Voices rose and fell. Coaches barked instructions, and laughter occasionally broke through the tension. She watched from a distance until one of the instructors approached her quietly. Dr. Holloway, would you like to speak to them? Nadine hesitated. Then she nodded. She stepped into the room, and silence fell. Recruits stood quickly, eyes widening, murmurs spreading. She looked around at their faces, young, nervous, hopeful. She spoke plainly. I know you've heard about Flight 372. I know some of you may have even trained on it as a case study. Several nodded. I want to tell you something no file can teach you. She paused. There's no script for dignity. There's no checklist for compassion. What you do every day up there matters. The way you speak to someone, the way you meet their eyes, it leaves an imprint. She let the silence stretch. I sat in 1A and was treated like I didn't belong. You now carry the responsibility of making sure no one feels that again. She smiled. Just a little. And I believe you will. Applause rose gently, growing louder. But Nadine had already turned to leave. She had never spoken for applause, only for impact. That evening, at home. She sat with Malcolm at the dinner table. He had made salmon, lemon roasted, and steamed greens. He poured her a glass of wine, set her plate, and said nothing until she finally looked up. I got a letter today, she said. He waited. From a trainee. Her name's Kelsey. She was on the flight. Malcolm leaned in, quietly. She said she watched what happened, and she's graduating tomorrow." He smiled. "The seed keeps growing." Nadine nodded. "I used to think justice was a moment, a verdict, a punishment, but now I see it's not. It's movement. It's what follows you after you've done the right thing." Malcolm lifted his glass to movement. They clinked glasses, the sound soft but solid. The next day, Nadine stood in the back of the training center's auditorium. She watched quietly as the new recruits were sworn in, each one stepping forward to receive their wings. When Kelsey Monroe walked across the stage, she looked briefly into the crowd and caught Nadine's eye. Her breath caught. Nadine gave a nod, just a small one, and Kelsey nodded back, her posture suddenly taller. After the ceremony, they did not speak. They didn't need to. Sometimes presence says everything. Outside, spring had begun to bloom in the city. Trees along the avenue near Jet Quasar's headquarters were dotted with pink and white blossoms. Pedestrians moved past unaware of the quiet revolution that had unfolded in the skies above them. But it was happening. Other airlines had begun consulting with Nadine. Academic papers were already being drafted about the Holloway Doctrine, a term coined by a transportation policy professor at Stanford to describe the intersection of equity and executive accountability. And more letters arrived, not always long, not always formal. A father whose son had finally flown without fear. A grandmother who said she no longer hid her accent when checking in at the gate. A trans teen who'd been called by their correct name and cried from the seat back row. The stories came one by one, and Nadine read each of them. She kept them in a drawer labeled Sky Echoes, because change was echoing, not loud, but lasting. That weekend, she and Malcolm took a flight together, not for business, just a trip. No press, no briefings, just the two of them. As they boarded, the flight attendant at the door smiled warmly. "Welcome aboard, Dr. Holloway, Mr. Holloway. It's an honor." Nadine nodded. "Thank you. You have no idea how much that means." They took their seats, first class, 1A and 1B, the same row, but this time the air was different. The quiet was respectful. The eyes that met hers were kind. As the plane took off, Malcolm reached for her hand. "Look at you," he whispered. She turned her head. "What?" He smiled, flying higher than ever. She laughed softly, the kind that came from relief and rebuilding. Outside, clouds gave way to blue, and above it all, in the cabin of that aircraft, the woman once silenced had become the voice of a new altitude. It was early, just past sunrise, when Nadine stepped into her office on the 41st floor of Jet Quasar headquarters. The city below was still rubbing the sleep from its eyes. Lights flickered on across buildings, cars moved slowly along quiet avenues, and the sky held a pale orange promise of morning. She stood in the quiet and breathed in the stillness. Her office was no longer lined with awards and polished plaques. It now held shelves of letters, framed photos of crew members and passengers who had written to her, and a large wooden board in the corner pinned with snapshots of change. Smiling crew, thank you cards, internal memos that had become manifestos. She poured herself a cup of coffee, dark and unadorned, and sat in her chair overlooking Manhattan. Today was her final board meeting as CEO. Not because she was leaving in shame, not because she was being pushed, but because she had done what she came to do. And now, it was time to give someone else the sky. She had spent the last 2 months working closely with her leadership team, quietly shaping the transition. She had looked at numbers, qualifications, management performance, but in the end, it wasn't about the resume. It was about the heart, and she knew exactly who was ready. Her assistant, Maya, entered quietly with a binder. "Morning," Maya said softly. "Morning. The boardroom's being prepped. Everyone will be there by 10. Press will be locked out until we release the statement." "Good." Maya hesitated. "You sure about this?" Nadine looked up. Her eyes weren't tired. They were settled. "I've never been more sure." Maya nodded and smiled. "She's going to do great." Nadine gave a small smile back. "She is." At 9:58 a.m., Nadine entered the boardroom. Every seat was filled. Most of the faces had changed over the past year. There were more women now, more people of color, more people who had once sat in cubicles rather than corner offices. She stood at the head of the table. No podium, no microphone, just her voice. "When I joined this company, I came in quietly. I wanted to work, not be seen. But when I was seen wrongly, I had a choice. Stay quiet or stand up." She paused, letting her words settle. "I stood up, and all of you stood with me. Together, we didn't just fix a moment. We changed a culture." She took a breath. "Today, I'm stepping down as CEO, not because I'm tired, but because it's time to pass the baton." The room shifted. Eyes moved. She turned to face a young woman sitting 3 seats to the left. Effective immediately. Maya Chen will serve as the new Chief Executive Officer of Jet Quasar Airlines. The room went still. Maya's lips parted slightly. Her breath caught. She hadn't expected the announcement to happen here. Like this. In front of everyone. Nadine smiled gently. "She didn't know I was going to say her name today, but she's known this was coming." There was a ripple of quiet applause. Then louder. Maya stood slowly, her hands slightly shaking, her voice soft but clear. I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," Nadine said. "Just lead." Later, as the meeting wrapped up and board members filed out, one by one offering hugs and handshakes, Maya sat beside Nadine in the empty room. "You could have stayed," Maya said. "They would have followed you anywhere." Nadine shook her head with a soft smile. "The goal of a great leader isn't to be followed forever. It's to leave when the house stands strong." She passed Maya a small leather notebook. Inside were handwritten notes, not financials, not strategy, just lessons, observations, things Nadine had learned from 3 decades in the sky. Maya flipped through it silently. On the final page, in Nadine's flowing hand, were 5 words. "Never forget who you are." "I don't want the spotlight," Maya said. "Good," Nadine replied. "Then you'll use it wisely." That evening, Nadine took the long way home. She walked instead of taking a car, past delis and bodegas, through tree-lined blocks where children played hopscotch on cracked sidewalks. She paused at a small bookstore, bought a novel with a blue cover, and slipped it into her bag. At home. Malcolm was waiting with dinner already on the stove. She stepped inside and kissed him on the cheek. "You look lighter," he said, stirring the sauce. I let go of something heavy. They ate in quiet, comfortably, as they often did. Later, on the balcony. She sipped chamomile tea and looked out at the city lights. Malcolm sat beside her, reading his music notes. He had a small concert the following week, a fundraiser for a youth jazz program in Harlem. "I'm not done, you know," Nadine said. He smiled without looking up. "I'd be surprised if you were. I just need to do things differently now. Less from a title, more from a voice." He closed his folder and looked at her. "Whatever you do it like you always have, with your whole damn soul." She leaned her head against his shoulder. The silence between them felt like warmth. That weekend, Nadine visited her childhood church in Baltimore. She didn't call ahead, she just showed up and sat in the back. The service was simple. The sermon was about restoration, not fixing, restoring. Afterward, an older woman approached her. "You're that airline woman, aren't you?" she asked. Nadine nodded slowly. "You changed something, baby. You opened something up. I hope so," Nadine said. The woman smiled. "Sometimes God puts you in 1A so you can shake the whole plane." Nadine laughed softly. She stayed for coffee hour. No cameras, no questions, just conversation. She listened to stories about flying, about being passed over, about fear, about small kindnesses at 40,000 feet. She carried those stories with her. She would always carry them. That night, she sat at her desk at home and wrote a new letter. Not to a board, not to the press, just to herself. "Dear Nadine, you are more than one flight. You are more than one title. You are the quiet in the storm. You are the change that stayed. Fly free. Love." Me, she folded it gently, slid it into a drawer marked personal. The sky waited, and she would find her way through it again. The gate agent smiled brightly as she handed back the boarding pass. "Thank you, Dr. Holloway. Boarding begins in 15 minutes. You're in 1A. Nadine gave a gentle nod, then stepped away from the counter, holding the small slip of paper between her fingers. She didn't look at the number right away. She didn't need to. The seat was muscle memory now. It had been the beginning, the rupture, the fire, and now, perhaps, the return. She settled into a corner seat near the window in the boarding area. It was a morning flight to Seattle. A short trip, just 3 hours, but her first since stepping down from Jet Quasar. This time, she wasn't flying to speak or fix or lead. She was flying just to fly. Outside the terminal windows, the tarmac shimmered in early light. A plane taxied slowly across the runway, its wings catching the sun. She took a long breath. She had spent the last few weeks in stillness. No meetings, no interviews, no boardrooms, just long walks through Prospect Park. Books she'd meant to read for years. Quiet meals with Malcolm, and letters, dozens of them. She read each one and answered most, one by one, carefully. Today was the first time she put on real shoes and packed a suitcase. When boarding was called, she rose with the first group, her steps steady. A young man in a vest checked her pass, did a double-take at her name, and gave her a respectful nod. As she stepped onto the jet bridge, the air changed. Cooler, quieter, a pocket of calm before the ascent. She entered the cabin, and there it was again. 1A, the same row, the same seat, leather a shade darker now, but the shape still familiar. She placed her tote under the seat, smoothed her dress, and leaned back. Across the aisle, a woman in 1B glanced over. "Good morning," she said politely. Nadine smiled. "Good morning." The boarding process continued. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the voices and shuffling become background noise. Then she heard a voice, calm, warm, professional. "Welcome aboard. Good morning." Nadine opened her eyes. The flight attendant had just stepped into the front galley. Young, composed, with short, natural curls and a confident posture. Her badge caught the light as she moved down the aisle. "Monroe." Nadine blinked. It was her Kelsey, the young woman who had written to her months ago. Kelsey didn't notice her at first. She was focused on her tasks, checking bins, assisting passengers, moving with efficiency and grace. When she reached the front row, she turned toward Nadine. Their eyes met. Recognition bloomed slowly across Kelsey's face. Her lips parted. Then she composed herself instantly. "Good morning," Dr. Holloway, she said softly, but clearly. Nadine smiled, voice low. Good morning, Ms. Monroe. Looks like you made it. Kelsey nodded, her voice catching for just a moment. I did. She paused, then leaned in slightly, her voice lowered. I've flown with so many people since I graduated, but this is the first time I've seen you again. And how's it going? Nadine asked gently. Kelsey breathed in. Better. Every flight. I remember what you said about being the quiet in the storm. I carry that. Nadine nodded. You're doing just fine. Kelsey smiled, eyes shimmering just slightly. The pilot made an announcement. The plane began to push back. Kelsey continued down the aisle. As the flight reached cruising altitude, Nadine stared out the window. Below her, the land stretched out in long ribbons of color, rivers carving through hills, patches of farmland, clouds casting slow-moving shadows. The cart rolled by quietly. Kelsey served the passengers in first class with steady hands. When she reached Nadine, she smiled again. Still take your coffee black. Nadine raised an eyebrow. You remember that I remember a lot, Kelsey said. She handed her the cup. There's a letter tucked in the bottom of the cup sleeve, Kelsey added softly. Not official. Just something I wrote. For you? Nadine looked down, saw the edge of a folded note inside the sleeve. She didn't read it right away. She held the warmth of the coffee, looked out the window, and waited. 30 minutes before landing, she unfolded the letter. Dear Dr. Holloway, I never told you this. On the night before my graduation flight, I almost dropped out. I had a moment, a bad dream, really. I was back on Flight 372, frozen in that seat, watching, doing nothing. I woke up ashamed. I thought, maybe I don't deserve to wear this uniform. But I remembered what you said. You didn't let shame define you. You used it to wake people up. So I got up that day. I graduated. I flew. And every flight, I try to do it right. Not perfect, but with heart. Thank you for reminding me that power doesn't always wear a name tag. Sometimes it just sits in 1A, calm as sky, with gratitude. Kelsey Nadine folded the letter and placed it back in the sleeve. Her eyes didn't fill with tears, but her chest swelled with something deeper, a kind of peace that came not from arrival, but from release. When the flight landed and the seatbelt sign clicked off, passengers rose, gathered their things, and shuffled forward. Nadine stayed seated. When Kelsey reached her row again, she stopped. Nadine stood and extended her hand. Kelsey took it. They didn't speak. They just stood there, the cabin quiet around them, and shared a look that held everything the skies had taught them both. Then Nadine stepped off the plane, back into the world, not as CEO, not as passenger, but as a woman who had changed the air itself. Sometimes the loudest change comes from the quietest corner of the room. She didn't yell, she didn't curse, she just sat in seat 1A and rewrote the rules of an industry from 30,000 feet in the air. Dr. Nadine Holloway's story is a reminder that dignity doesn't beg, that justice isn't always a headline. Sometimes it's a ripple that turns into a wave. And for every person who's ever been made to feel invisible, for every passenger who's ever been asked to prove they belong, this story is yours too. But it's also a challenge, because the question remains, if you had been on that flight, what would you have done? Discrimination hides in plain sight, but so does courage, and sometimes all it takes is one calm voice to change the sky for everyone. If this story moved you, let it move someone else too. Please like, share, and subscribe to the channel, because stories like this matter, and we have more to tell. Much more. We'll see you on the next flight.